Welcome back to my channel, Star Booze.
He created an empire, deceived death, and become the embodiment of American perseverance. But Clint Eastwood's icy gaze conceals ice. Live tale is more bizarre than fiction. Endured a plane crash and managed to swim through shark-infested waters. He retained the whole family's kept out of the public eye for decades, and the reality is that he may not even understand how many kids he actually has, from unanticipated celebrity to living off the grid love stories and near Mrs. Thatneth rumors. But this isn't that you believe you know Clint, you clean-cut cowboy. Despite being a living legend, what if Eastwood the true tale that Hollywood refuses to tell demonstrate your dramatic flair even more than the movies that made him well known? Because Clint's life's last turn. Clint. This may be his most startling yet. Eastwood didn't simply come into the world. Entered the world, born on May 31st, 1930. At San Francisco's St. Francis Hospital, the newborn's weight tipped at astounding 11 pounds. The nurses were astounded. They called him Samson, following the biblical strongman. A precursor to Clint was not going to be your typical life. Wouldn't be made easier by strength alone. Simple. His parents are Ruth and Clinton Sr. Eastwood was a member of the working class, whose origins are in England, the Netherlands, Scotland, and even a passenger on the Mayflower. But by the time the American dream was present when Clint was born, disintegrating, the Great Depression had left millions in a state of confusion, and the Clint Eastwoods was no exception. The father found it difficult to keep his job moving between positions, initially as a salesperson and later as a worker in a factory, and even for a short time as a detective in San Francisco. Elsewhere, when the chance presented itself, they took it. Consequently, Clint's early years were spent in continuous movement that never stops town long enough to establish a foundation. San Francisco, Sacramento, Spokane, Reddington. Returns to California weren't merely annoying. They worklet never had the opportunity to become disoriented. To agree to become lifelong friends or felt completely at home. That consistent he would be shaped by instability. Strong, perceptive, and restrained qualities that would eventually turn as his signature on screen, but they were actually fabricated by 1940. It was survival rather than Hollywood scripts. The Eastwoods' tide finally shifted, arrived in the upscale suburb of Piedmont, and his father discovered a job in the Bay Area. Stable position with Georgia Pacific. Suddenly, the company stopped scraping by all means. They had a lovely home, a country club, and a swimming pool and blums for membership status that created on the surface. Clint's life appears to be ideal. Surface, but Clint didn't suit the description of he wasn't the tidy country club kid. Eager to learn and didn't observe what's the point of adhering to school rules, but him and people in positions of authority rubricated him incorrectly. He was repressed at junior high school grade and was required to take summer courses to make up lost time. Then high school arrived, and that's where everything started. Went completely crazy. Clint was brash and simply belligerent. He vandalizes and graffiti on school property, and putting a burning effigy up on the last straw was the school grounds. He was abruptly ejected from Piedmont High. The secure, tidy life he had just begun to encounter was torn away once more. Attended Oakland Technical High School, but teachers observed the same pattern. Talent bursts, particularly in the theater. However, Clint didn't care for drama class. He found Engine's melody to be fascinating. He was already tuning into freedom and girls, turning down the noise and listening to a distant. He wasn't chasing anyone outside the system, not yet famous, but he was already fleeing something, and the subsequent events would send leading him in a direction he could never have anticipated. After being kicked out of Clint Eastwood's second at Piedmont High, Oakland was a fortunate find. A gritty working class group is Technical High. School that was lacking in Polish or Piedmont status. But Clint didn't concern. He wasn't seeking notoriety but pursuing freedom, sound, and speed. At some teachers at Oakland Tech saw his potential. They attempted to persuade him to perform in school performances while detecting a presence even at that time that attracted notice. Yet stage lights didn't interest Clint at all. His performance concept wasn't in front of the piano in front of a crowd, behind the wheel of a fast car, or in a garage. He spent hours repairing engines and cars, practicing and speeding down back roads. One friend played the piano till his fingers bled, remembered observing him perform till his rather than motivated by ambition. Knuckles cracked but obsessive. He had the potential to be a fantastic escatal player as well, but solitary activities, tennis, golf. He could manipulate things like music machines. Items that were not related to school. It was optional. Official documents, Arihazi, but the majority think Clint never truly received his degree. According to his Fritz Maines, a lifelong friend, Clint just ceased to appear one day and never looked back. But instead he got on the couch with friends, shared rooms with each other, and wandered without a definite goal or grand ambition. Simply confidence and instinctual instinct that eventually something would occur. Then the Korean War broke out in 1951. Was going strong when Uncle Sam arrived. Clint was drafted into the United States. However, rather than the battlefield, he arrived in California's fort, or about as secure a position that a soldier could desire. He served as a swimming instructor. Cozy job that allowed him to maintain his tan remains active and distant from areas of conflict. But destiny wasn't about to give him that much leeway. In September, Clint was hitching a ride back on the 30th of 1951. A military base from Seattle aircraft. It ought to have been standard procedure. Flight. It wasn't only a few minutes. When heavy weather struck, visibility decreased, the cabin was jolted by turbulence, and then worsened. The aircraft's rear door. Clint abruptly flew out of midair, and the pilot was able to rig it shut using parachute cords. Yet the circumstances remained unraveling. The oxygen was not picked up by the radio. System failure, followed by the unimaginable somewhere off the coast. Fuel ran out. California. Amid the icy fog of the Pacific, the pilot had to abandon the aircraft into the sea without a GPS or rescue crew assurance that they would live for the next 5. Clint was able to inflate a life for a few minutes, but it was overturned by a rogue wave. He began tossing him into the water, swimming in frigid water, and confused estimates of hallucinations indicate that he swam over 2 miles through icy black water. Sharks are all around to get to land after several hours. He stumbled onto a rocky beach and headed to an isolated Arky radio station. He was drenched, barefoot, and live but half delirious. So was the pilot, almost drowned at that moment. He never left the sea after vanishing into it when he acted in escape. Years later, critics of Alcatraz commended that his scenes on the chilly bay are realistic. They were unaware that he had already ended a much worse situation. Yet, the most astounding aspect, that wasn't even the final instance of Clint Eastwood's infidelity with. Following a narrow escape from an aircraft, most people would slow down Clint in an accident. Back on dry, Eastwood took the reverse action. Land. He went back to doing odd jobs just to maintain the lights on while logging trees again, playing ragtime piano while pumping gas in bars in Oakland. He was once not quite working at a pulp mill glitzy start, but that unfiltered the tenacity of the working man stayed with him forever. And then the sort of you can't schedule a break for a pal asked Clint to attend a Malibu party where an assistant for casting just so happened to be searching for new faces. They noticed something: Clint Paul's startling silence intensity. Eventually, he managed to land Agathiad with Universal and obtained a contract, but the action took place later. He was initially portrayed as a glorified extra, merely background filler with a stern gaze in 1959. Following a turning between a few unmemorable roles, Rose Rowdy was Clint's first major role. Yates on the television program Rawhide was popular, and Clint appeared out of nowhere. Every American living room. But Ith wasn't a star because of his rough hide. That moment was so close that thousands of directors. Sergio is located in Italy, kilometers distant. Leone was creating a rough, updated version of He Needed Someone Who Looked at the Western Clint. You're dangerous without a word. A clutch of money was ideal. Then for a couple of bucks more and the introduction of the good, the terrible, and the ugly, entire globe to the nameless Menanti hero with a sluggish draw and a squint. These weren't quicker trigger fingers. Simply Western movies. They were at Eastwood that changed from background actor to a worldwide symbol without never truly altering his identity. But simply when he rose to fame, his movies focused on to take a more sinister and perilous turn, and reality would be closer than by the 1970s. Nobody anticipated Clint Eastwood had evolved beyond a simple cowboy. In Dirty, the legal system was one man. Inspector Harry Callahan was the role he portrayed, a San Francisco police officer who didn't follow regulations and made no apologies. The part was a cultural lightning strike. Eastwood was become more than simply Asta. He represented the tenacity or revenge of the American individual who conducted business regardless of the expense. Fans referred to it as unsafe. Clint's rewrite was so captivating. Tragedy was creeping up on the laws of cinema. Behind the scenes as the movie was being filmed off the 1975 Iger sanction, Clint Squad required last-minute shots for a risky mountain climbing sequence with 2 professionals climbers. Mike Hoover and David Knowles were brought in, and the video was recorded. The task seems completed, but then Knowles was unprepared when the avalanche struck, hit and died right away. Hoover was severely wounded. It was a terrible spectacle, and exacerbated by this chilling fact that the precise moment had been acted out on camera only a few days before. But now it was genuine. Clint was devastated and almost stopped talking. A whole movie out of remorse. But his crew persuaded him to complete it in order to commemorate a deceased man's life and work. This was hardly Eastwood's first encounter with the wreckage. But this time it was more than just a matter of survival. Concerning accountability and the weight of it remained with him, and Clint was continuing to display his humorous abilities with the exception of Loose Movies Future and Gopasite Clyde, an orangutan. Only Clint was able to go from death scenes on mountaintops to fights in bars with a monkey and maintain a following. However, behind the laughing and the action, his characters were changing in some way, were becoming less complex and darker. Bulletproof, and the subsequent events whereuntinly the tone changed. It was a reckoning. One that Clint would have to fasten out only on screen antagonists, but also independently. By the late 1980s, Clint, in addition to being an action star, Eastwood no more. He was evolving into something greater. The tough ones are contemplative and dangerous. He performed while still carrying a lot of heat, but they now also bore emotional scars. He was a fighter pilot who was gripped by Firefox. By PTSD and a detective's tightrope, not only by a murderer, but also by his own darkness. His persona began making mistakes and displaying a bleed of just bodily but also mentally. Additionally, Clint was changing behind the camera even more quickly. He started directing with increased emphasis and a reduction in Hollywood glitz for unadulterated narrative. He used imaginative veracity over his work, and it resulted in A in 1992. In a manner that none could overlook when Unforgiven debuted in theaters, it blew the Clint, separating genres, went back to Houston but not as bold this time. He played William Money, a broken outlaw, a man with a history of violence who was pulled back into the very shadows he attempted to escape. It wasn't a fantasy about power, a reckoning. The movie took critics by surprise, didn't glorify the Old West. Instead, it devastated Clint Eastwood for the first time. The film didn't end on a positive note, with That Quietness brought him to Best Picture and Best Director Oscars. However, he wasn't finished with 2004's Baby Clint. The Yandela played a tired boxing instructor defending a stronghold of emotional distress. The movie took a terrible turn, one that dealt with loss of devotion and the type of heart-to-shade that Hollywood typically stays away from. Critics dubbed it a masterpiece, and it took home for Gran Torino followed the Oscars, where Walt Kowalski was portrayed by Clint as racist. A war-hardened veteran must face seal that he despises in other people and in personally. It wasn't a return. Rather, it was a warning shot from an unarmed guy. Everything is still to be spoken, but left to prove. Mystic. Even the titles seemed heavier. Uema River letters, changing thieves were stories rather than popcorn movies concerning truth, failure, morality, and sadness. Clint was no longer only acting. He was whose film to solve a problem, deeper legacy of regret and sorrow. Because as the personalities grew darker, Clint's behind locked doors in real life, the spirits weren't only made up. And what image you would then bring his personal life into Clint Eastwood, the public figure. Constructed Amen that played in their careers but didn't adhere to thorough and off-screen. That pattern accompanied him home, where he wed his first on paper. It was wife Maggie Johnson in 1953. Appeared to be the beginning of a grounded American lifestyle. But in a matter of months, Clint was already having some extramarital affairs, short-lived others that change your life, and in the fallout, in typical Eastwood manner, was concealed for many years the initial secret. Laurie Murray, a girl born from an affair when he was just starting out in Hollywood, she was discreetly put up for adoption. Without Clint's knowledge, for almost 30 she'd spent years living her life without knowing who at the time her biological father was in the CIA. Engaged a private investigator in the 1990s, discovered the facts and made contact with Clint, surprised her by welcoming her. But though the more important question remains, did Heterly unknown, or did he decide not to? It would not be the final time that Clint's hidden child appeared, the shadow of Eastwood while yet wed to McGee. Clint went into a 14-year connection with Roxanne Tunis, a stint woman Kimber, another daughter of that when Eastwood was born. Clint first refused paternity, which he later acknowledged, and Kimber, she has been open about the emotional turbulence of maturing ace. At one point, Clint's secret child even begged openly to establish a stronger bond with. He revealed more mysteries when they came to light. Kids at the end of the day. Eastwood Ice verified to be the father of 6 different women's children, Ember, that even devoted admirers were shocked by when the complete image was released. One-off chapters that were most explosive in the lock. An actress met Clint in 1972 on the Outlaw Josie's set. Wales, and even though they are both indifferent, the chemistry was immediately apparent. They lived together for 10 years. It appeared to be a dedicated collaboration. However, Latch revealed behind closed doors that in a bitter, something far darker litigation that shook tabloids in the Latch, she said that Clint had forced her in the 1980s, pushing her into having several abortions, scarier while covertly constructing a set with other females. Throughout their connection, she filed a fraud lawsuit and she was able to reach a settlement after subsequently stated that it had broken assurances. And as that drama developed, Clint has already fathered 2 children in public. Additional kids that Scott and Catherine Haverline worker Jaceline Reeves. That connection was completely removed from the radar. Birth certificates were sent to unknown father years later. When the fact surfaced, it made headlines once more. Now an actor in his own right, Scott Eastwood has revealed their unusual connection. He claims Clint didn't give him everything, but don't use the fast track. Prefers only a self-discipline, lesson, work ethic, and being present even in the face of. Clint's subsequent significant relationship was Frances Pfizer, an actress, and they had a Francesca, the daughter, revealed what seemed to be a more stable and softer link, but once more, it was short-lived. Then Dina Ruiz has been a TV anchor for 35 years as a junior. Married in 1996, and Clint appeared to Bahad at last made their home, and they had a daughter, Morgan. However, when Dina consented to illustrate the fractures in a reality show began to display Clint's constant intensity. Private detested the publicity around the marriage, disintegrated, and came to an end in 2013. Clint Hassans discovered peaceful friendship with Christina. Sandra is a restaurant hostess. Relationship that is very low-key, just the silence with no headlines or tabloid stability that he seemed to have sought all of his life. And during it all, Clint has accomplished an unimaginable feat of balance. Preserving his complicated blended family, he has been seen at events and is largely undamaged, with several ex-partners, kids from several mothers, including grandchildren, smiling, laughing, and hugging. Isn't the Hollywood loves a tidy plot, but it's the Clint Eastwood's life and the events that follow it then shown to the world that even in ancient age he had one more act to perform. Him as Hollywood monitored his every move, Clint's romance and box office success in the background. Eastwood was establishing an empire. To the general public, one property at a time. Hellas, the tough anti-hero who had a shooter. But Clint, behind closed doors, was mostly using high-level power maneuvers. Not in the movie, people never saw it coming. Real estate studios. It began with a fantasy, one that was born while he was in the army, and while assigned to Fort Ord in the 1950s, Clint would frequently flee to a nearby Carmel by the sea as a serene beach village with sea air and rocky cliffs that appeared to be miles apart from the mayhem of Thorold. He once remarked, "I hope to summit airside here." Expansive construction of 2,000 acres just beyond Carmel. It's more than simply a golf course, but a refuge reserved for members alone. Intended to combine architecture and nature art, Clint contributed to the creation of anything from theft to the membership of the Chandeliers Restrict to only 300 individuals. This isn't only real estate. This is a private realm constructed by Eastwood. For each Eastwood property conveys a distinct narrative. The ranch, the desert, the coast, and the mountains sea. Yet they all refer to the Clint Eastwood has invested a lot of lifetime creating areas under his authority, peaceful, timeless areas where no conclusion can be altered by the script. And as the world conjectured about his health, Clint Eastwood's legacy and future, working on his upcoming chapter from both from behind the camera and from the nobody saw the empire's gates approaching. Silence in Hollywood is uncommon, and when the disappearance of someone like Clint Eastwood, the rumors don't come from the public eye. Begin. And they blow up. For more than 450 days that Clint Eastwood was absent from public. No interviews, no event looks, not even a round of golf for a man who seemed to be everywhere at one point. Whispers began to spread after he disappeared. Was he alright? That something worse occurred. Was Clint Eastwood no longer there? The rumors reached an all-time high in 2023, when even his Scott Eastwood, his son, arrived at their yearly AT&T Pro-Am golf competition. It was an occasion they had without Clint. Nearly always went together. But this Scott's seat was vacant at the time. Fans were alarmed by tabloids, and some even started sharing tributes, certain that since Eastwood remained silent, the end had arrived in silence. And then he resurfaced. Clint Eastwood was in April 2024. Captured on camera at a conservation event. Jane Goodall is the one hosting. Directly in Carmel, his hometown. By the he wasn't concealing, and he wasn't weak. Was grinning and sporting long hair. White beard and striking resemblance to Eight. Was the return of the man who was still in charge. Nobody anticipated him arriving. Weeks later, he was observed on Juror Number 2's set. He directed the legal thriller at the age of 94. The narrative centers on a man who learns he might be accountable for the offense he's elected to evaluate. Psychologically Clint, but from behind this timeth lens, where he's possibly even more striking images from the Georgia set demonstrated Eastwood's complete involvement in providing actors' notes to Nicholas Hall and Toni Collette, eliciting admiration with calm concentration. No chair or cane, just presence. Clint credits behind the scenes health to a basic self-control. He maintains a low-fat high. He monitors his cholesterol with a protein diet. He still lifts weights and goes on daily walks regimen. He began many years ago and inherited by his son Scott Fatlefest, which goes beyond health. Due to the fact that Clint Eastwood wants to live longer than simply wishes to work more and think more clearly, go farther, and when he eventually takes a step away from the camera, as he desires according to his own terms. But the true query is not the amount of time Clint Eastwood will stay going. What precisely is he still attempting to tell? The narrative of Clint Eastwood is more than just a movie star's story. It's the path of a man who never gave up changing despite the world's pleas for him. Toto remained unchanged from a tall birth dubbed Samson after a famous person in Hollywood avoided drowning in the Pacific. Friends were buried by scandal after scandal, established empires, and left a legacy as more nuanced than any role he has portrayed. Clint Eastwood was never one to stick to a script. He simply lived his life, redefining his films. Masculinity, his quiet grew louder, more than the majority of people yelling, and as they have to decades, one thing became evident. Clint has no desire to be a hero. He simply does it to be honest, even when it regardless of the ghosts. It was awful and unforgiven. The wounded, gunsling $1 million baby's trainer, or their resentful elderly veteran looking for pastry. Character in Gran Torino was an a representation of the person he was acting as, but of the man he was developing into. Man who didn't build houses to impress or go away from a man who directed movies but for notoriety, but for power. A man who created errors, had secrets, and were all of his detractors. And at 94, Clint Eastwood remains still. He is not pursuing, he is still working and creating a last masterwork, which he is subtly adding final strokes of a life that most of we couldn't even fathom, not being flawless, polished yet genuine. As perhaps Clint the best performance by Eastwood wasn't. It was surviving the on-screen repeatedly storming and leaving in the same serene gaze that initiated it. If this news caught you off guard, it prompted you to view Clint Eastwood in its entirety. Tell us what the new light drop looks like. Most surprised, you in the comments. And if you desire more hidden legends stories, hit the subscribe button. We're only receiving